people said they were going to have to be late, Karma, so I think we can start. So again, thank you everybody for showing up. Karma joined us at Middle Way in January, and I like to say that he's holding two grounds at the school. He makes sure that everything's working and functioning well. As soon as he got there, all the drawers were opening nicely and everything was just feeling very secure, and that same kind of security he was bringing to the staff by leading our morning meditations and giving teachings on the various themes that we have at the school. So we're doing interconnection or impermanence, and Karma can meet with the teachers and give them a Buddhist perspective on those topics. So, and then he also leads these open conversations. Oh, I don't know if someone will join. So we're happy to share our human resource of Karma. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah. So we have a few people here also, if I'm sort of looking around the room. I'm at Milarepa Retreat Center in Tennessee, in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, and I live here part of the year and I'm a resident teacher. I'm building a stupa and retreat center, and then the rest of the year I'm in New York at Middle Way. So I think a lot of this will be following on the previous talk that I gave about a month ago, and that talk was on finding refuge in uncertain times, and today's talk will be about fostering communities, resilient communities in times of change, of uncertainty, of rapid tumult and all of what's going on. And there's a quote that I came across recently that says, things are getting worse and worse and better, faster and faster. So it's hard to say what's going on, but it does feel like things are speeding up in some sense. So let's start by slowing down, and we can just do some sitting for maybe 3-5 minutes. So I invite you to find a good, comfortable posture and place to sit. So we'll begin just like a baby in its first moment by breathing in and breathing out. As we breathe in, imagine breathing into a very expansive, open space within you. And breathing out with a sense of release. And breathing in, noticing resistance. Ways that we've armored ourselves. Breathing out. Allow space. And so as we invite spaciousness with the breath in this way, we notice what is holding on, points of fixation. Our body, our emotions, or thought stream. And just notice that and continue to breathe. Allowing space for whatever arises to be just as it is. Okay. So I have a bad back injury, so I may be doing funny things in the middle of the next hour or so. Anyway, so like I said, we're gathering here at Milarepa Retreat Center, and this is a Karma Kagyu retreat center in Tennessee, and that's the lineage that I was trained in, which is one of the main lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And I trained in New York, in upstate New York for many years. And a lot of what I'll share today is the fruit of that training coming together with the necessity of making the tradition understandable and relevant in many ways to the different dispositions of people in our society and the unique times that we're living in and so forth. So there's really a lot of different strands coming together, but it's rooted very much in the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, which for me was primarily a contemplative path, practice-based, but also a lot of study. And at different points I'll be quoting different teachers and making reference to different sources of where this inspiration has come from. So invite at the end we'll open it up for questions and also hopefully discussion. And I can go over anything again in terms of sources, because I know last time people really enjoyed knowing and learning more about the different lineages and sources that I was drawing from. So anyway, so what I'd like to talk about today is really two different things that are related. On one hand, this aspect of community, which is really crucially important now for many reasons. The most pointed of which is obviously that we're so separated, and that our sense of community, we have a quarantine community, and we have sort of agreements about how that operates, and you can do that, but generally we don't see very many people very often anymore, and if we do, it's in this context, online, through these kind of virtual exchanges. And so the question of community now and also going forward is really important, because this time has given us a perspective on, in some sense, what matters most, the kind of communities that we call home and value. And also, I think it has given some perspective on, in going forward in the future, what kind of community do we really want to foster in contexts like these that are trying in different ways, crises, things like that, and just in general, knowing what we know and seeing what we value, being able to go forward with intention to form communities around those shared values, what is really important to us. So that's the first part, and then the second is resilience. And resilience is, when I picked the topic, I had thoughts, and then I started looking around, and it's it's a total buzzword, and I was starting to get nauseous. But it's important nonetheless, and I'll talk about it both in the context of the Buddha Dharma in the Buddhist teachings, what it might mean, and also in more modern psychological or educational contexts, and so forth. And then trying to bring these two together, trying to look forward to and have a sense of what a resilient community that is based in our shared values might be, and what are its qualities, and how does it sustain itself, and how does it inspire us, and how does it make the world, our communities, how can it make the world a better place? And so lots of questions like these. So where we left off, in the last talk, we talked about refuge, and ultimate refuge being this recognition of groundlessness. And we're in a very groundless and uncertain time. And many people don't know where their next paycheck is coming from. We don't know when we'll see certain people again, when various aspects of our lives will return to normal. And for some that's a huge relief. For me, it's somewhat of a relief. And for others, obviously, it's not. And especially those who the uncertainty is so felt so deeply that they don't. It's uncertain whether you're going to be able to take another breath. It gets to that level. You can get to that level. So this aspect of groundlessness is really present for us. But from a Buddhist perspective, that's normal. That's the norm, and that's something that that it's our goal and our training to become acquainted with, and to be able to actually dance within that kind of groundlessness, that spaciousness. That there's a quote that we ended with last time from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche about, he says, enlightenment is like jumping out of an airplane, and the bad news is that you don't have a parachute, and the good news is that there is no ground. And so we're in this free fall, and in this free fall we can take refuge in different ways. And so last time we talked about how aspects of fear, of doubt, uncertainty, and adversity in general can be the perfect occasion for developing our capacity for compassion, because that very the rawness of it, and the way that this groundlessness cuts through our armor, like I was saying in the beginning here, our defenses, our habits, our bubble, really lays our heart bare, and we have the opportunity then in that openness to step out, to care, to exchange, to care for, and to be cared for. And so there's that aspect that groundlessness allows for. And then on an ultimate level, groundlessness is total freedom. We are free falling, but there is no risk involved unless we create it ourselves, unless we get into a fear cycle and try to fill in the ground artificially with whatever kind of projects and hallucinations we might have. And so from a Buddhist perspective, and we try to look at it also through a secular lens, this state is an existential condition. We're just open, right, and falling. And how do we familiarize ourselves with that so that it becomes our home? And then going further in today's talk, how do we fall together? How do we recognize that we're not alone in free fall, but we're actually falling together? And what does it mean to fall together? And how can that be, the kind of situation of Sartre's no exit, where hell is other people, because you're in free fall and you're with all of these other people that rub you the wrong way and worse? Or how can falling together be part of a dance, in space? How can falling together be a celebration of freedom and commonality and community, right? So that's kind of the point of origin, and I'd like to start by talking about first talking about resilience, and then come back to community after that. So when we, in terms of in our current time, there's many of you might know of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist teacher. And he said many things, many kind of controversial or revolutionary things about the way that we relate to the current time. And he said that, in this time, what we need is a collective enlightenment in order to stop the course of environmental, in that case, destruction. And that the historical Buddha achieved individual awakening. But what we need on a collective level, an awakening on that level. And it's helpful to recognize that we don't know what enlightenment means, and this is something that one of our teachers, Dzondzor Chensen Rinpoche, talks about a lot, how we talk about enlightenment, but it's just a concept, and it's kind of a fantasy in different ways, because we don't actually know what that means. And so when we talk about collective enlightenment, I think it's more helpful to understand it in terms of a path, that enlightenment is something that we are discovering, and it's a path that we're traveling together. And so when we shift it in that direction, and understand that what the world needs at this point is a collective awakening, it means that it can be very, very helpful to see that we are all on a path, and the more we can join together on that path, the better. And that shift is itself one of the main, obviously community is evoked there, but that shift of understanding our experience as part of a path is one of the most important ingredients in developing resilience. It's something that's called framing, or it's something that allows us to interpret what's going on, whether it's positive or negative, as being part of a coherent whole, right? It's part of a larger picture. And no longer is it our private and unique struggle in a random universe, right? It's part of a bigger picture. So that's really the first thing. But at the same time, not everyone is going to be Buddhist, especially, or necessarily spiritual in any given way. And so we have to also look at what it means to make that shift and understand our experience in terms of a path in a secular lens, right? And understand that anyone, anywhere, no matter what they're practicing or not practicing, can contextualize their experience in that way, and that's really important. And we can talk about how we might do that in different ways, because the communities that we create ideally will not be insular, right? They gain their resilience from their diversity, and so any way in which we limit diversity is actually going to be limiting resilience in many different ways. So that's an important part in question, and it's an open question. How do we conceive of ourselves collectively on a path without our individual paths being contradictory, right? And so that's something we can talk about later as well. So from a Buddhist perspective, resilience, when I wrote this blurb, Noah was like, what does resilience mean from a Buddhist context? And I was grateful for that, because I didn't know. But I think the best way to think about resilience is, again, in the context of a path where whatever arises on the path, obstacles that arise on the path, and adversity, like we talked about last time, can be brought into that context. In other words, it's not something that derails us or something that totally challenges our progress, so to speak, but it's something that we can see as part of the whole game, really. And so taking adversity onto the path, understanding obstacles on the path to be part of the path. And this comes down to the logic of a spiritual path, because what we're doing is going beyond ego, right? But at the same time, the path is something that is leading us beyond ego. And a collective path is leading us beyond our collective hang-ups, personal and collective. But at the same time, it's the ego that's traveling the path. And so there's an inherent contradiction there. Like we're taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, right? It's like, how does the ego dismantle itself, right? And so understanding that, when obstacles arise, they're just a mirror of that situation. Because the ego is creating this whole drama, the obstacles that arise are part of that whole drama the ego is creating. And so if we can recognize that the obstacles or adversity that's arising for us is actually part of our own projection, our own situation, whether personal or collective, we can recognize it on the spot. It doesn't mean it's going to resolve itself necessarily immediately, but it does mean that we're not going to be struggling against it, and we're not going to be derailed by it. There's a sense of humor in the whole thing, because we know that it's kind of this drama that is playing out through this kind of personal and collective projection going on. So, that's really important to have in mind, just the idea that whatever is arising for us on our path, that is difficult especially, and oftentimes things that are enticing as well, they're part of the program, and they're part of the journey, right? And so we recognize them in that way. So we'll come back to that aspect of the Dharma and of a spiritual path is obviously hugely important, because anyone who has done any kind of practice, either immediately or sometime down the road, all at once the sky falls, and there's this serious pushback from our virtuous intention, right? So that's one aspect of resilience. And then from the more modern and academic, sociological, psychological point of view, there's different aspects of what constitutes resilience. And what I just talked about in terms of a spiritual path is there's actually not a word for that type of resilience in English or in our studies so far, where what arises, obstacles that arise, not only do they not derail us, but we can use them to progress further. And so resilience in this sense means not only do we stand back up when we get knocked down, but we've grown even stronger because of having been knocked down. And so on the path, these obstacles that we encounter, when we are able to metabolize them fully, they open our minds and our hearts much more fully. And so we become more resilient in that sense. And so that's the way I'm using resilience. But there's a researcher, Nassim Taleb is his name, who talks about the fact that we don't have a good word for that. And resilience actually means, strictly speaking, what I just said, being able to get up when you've been knocked down, or a system that when it's been destroyed is able to reconstitute itself. Robustness is another kind of distinction. Robustness means you're strong, you're resistant to falling apart, you're resistant to being knocked over, and so you're less likely to get knocked over. But then he introduces this idea called anti-fragility, and it's a mouthful, so we won't talk about it too much. But the idea is just what I mentioned before, that something that's anti-fragile grows stronger the more it's challenged. And so you see this in nature, like bones that have been broken will fuse back together more strongly than they were before. Trees that have been exposed to high winds have much more strength, obviously, in their trunks than those that have never been exposed to high winds. And then when suddenly a high wind comes by, they are destroyed and blown over. So that kind of aspect of growing stronger through adversity is what he means by anti-fragility. And this is important because there's a whole discussion about how that enters into education, because and parenting as well, because obviously we want to do our best to protect and have a safe holding environment for our children, and we want them to be able to grow safely in that holding, and it's that very holding that actually allows for the brain to develop fully, for the body to develop motor skills and all of that, because if there's too many stressors in the environment, the mind and body are stunted in various ways. But conversely, if children aren't challenged, and obviously it's age dependent, you don't want to quote the Nietzsche, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. You don't want to quote that to a 2-year-old. It's not really appropriate. But by the time children grow a bit, if they haven't been challenged in various ways, and in certain ways that maybe we would be uncomfortable with as parents, then there's a researcher named Jonathan Haidt who his idea is that the huge levels of teenage anxiety and depression and even suicide that are emerging more and more in current generations is in large part due to the lack of challenge in the environments, in the growing environments of those children when they were younger. And that's a hypothesis, you can't, you can debate it, but I think there's something there that is true, and we can draw on that when we think about resilience, because it really, especially as adults at least, it really does make sense in different ways. So, I'm just trying to paint a portrait here of the different dimensions of resilience, so that we can have, we can draw from these different aspects to have the conversation about how that enters into community later. So another dimension comes from as a more psychological dimension, and in that dimension, resilience is really based in two things. One primary and hugely important thing is human connection. And like I mentioned, when the holding environment when we're younger, if there is a sense of attunement with our caregivers, and later in life, if we have healthy and stimulating social relationships that are nurturing, that we can care and be cared for, that produces a tremendous amount of resilience. And there are great examples of how that's actually our normal human condition. So there's a book, let me see, so I was reading, based on one of the last meetings we had in book group, there's this book called Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit, and she's looking at all these different disasters that happened it was mostly American history, like the fire in the turn of the century in San Francisco, and Hurricane Katrina, and September 11th in New York, and showing through sociological research how it's in these crisis situations, it's actually human nature in some sense to act altruistically and to form communities based on that altruistic basis, that intention, and how the resilience that comes from human interaction is already there, and what goes wrong is that it's doubted, and that whether it's authorities or minorities within within a population that cause havoc, or authorities that come in and try to manage things with a predetermined idea of needing to rein in the animalistic sort of inborn chaos that humans have. Those are the elements that cause the discord. But if you just let people self-organize and do what they do, they form caring and supportive communities just as a function of being there in crisis. That's what humans do, and so it's important to recognize that message, and then in general just know that this aspect of human connection is super important. And that's a question for us. Another, you can put another bookmark there, like how do we, both in this time when we're on Zoom a lot, how do we make use of that hugely important source of resilience, of human connection? How do we creatively find human connection, and how do we make the most of the connections we have, right? And so then the second aspect, from a psychological point of view, of resilience has to do with it's called framing, or interpreting adversity, interpreting our experience. Because when we're able to interpret it, and this is, I've already talked about this in the Dharmic context, in terms of understanding our experience as a path, but just in general, when there is stress and we're unable to interpret it and make sense of it, that means that we're also unable to act upon it. And that lack of agency and lack of coherence completely undercuts any resilience. It just totally destroys it. And so, that's another really important thing. And we'll come back to that again at the end. But I've already suggested that one, coherent framework that we can draw upon is understanding that our experience is part of a path, right? So we'll come back to that. So there was a group of, sorry, I'm going to have to do some traction here by hanging my spine. So there was a group of Western Buddhist teachers who went to see the Dalai Lama, and they asked him, what is the most important piece of advice that you can give us? And he said that, I'm paraphrasing, but he said that it's really important that people understand that they have the strength of heart and the wisdom to make any situation into a path of awakening. And so, that's a really radical statement, because, we can imagine a lot that we wouldn't wish on anyone, right? And levels of adversity, of suffering, of pain. But it's important to preserve the voice that says, no matter what's happening, we all have an inborn basic goodness and an inborn wisdom that is adequate to understanding what is happening as part of a path and as a occasion for awakening. And obviously we can talk about what awakening might mean for different people, but it's really important to have that as a reference point out there. That and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, he talked about this a lot as well. Just being able to trust your experience. He says in many different ways. Every experience is workable. Every situation is workable. There's always a hole somewhere that we can start to move within, right? And nothing is totally static or solid. And what seems like an overwhelming situation is totally overwhelming because of the projection we've laid upon it. And if we can suspend that habit of projecting, we can see, the holes and the point of access that allow us to work with it. And so these are voices of wisdom, right? And you can take it or leave it. And I know a lot of people who would just sort of write that off, and it's not enough to convince anyone necessarily. But hopefully, just by planting that seed, that at least some people who are worthy of respect in different ways believe that every situation is workable, can give us courage, right, and can lead us to become closer to that confidence. And that's really the bottom line, is that it's part of a process of connecting with our own basic goodness, becoming more confident that we have that and that we are that. And that's a huge part of developing resilience as well, right? So one important thing, we started by saying that we're falling together, and that resilience is something that we are exploring as collectively, right? So one important thing that we can notice happening in general in our culture, I think, is that this idea of resilience can be co-opted by a false narrative. In other words, when we talk about being resilient, it can be all about the individual. It can be all about me and my problems, and then developing the strength to be able to deal with them, and that's good. But when it's not seen as part of a collective whole, it can be co-opted by, we might say neoliberalism to be complicated, but just the sort of the institutions that can profit from our lack of confidence, our lack of faith, and can also profit from our adaptability to becoming highly functional in oppressive systems. And so we can be caught both ways. And really the only way out is to understand that it's all of us together becoming resilient that really offers an opportunity for growth. Either way, but it's just important to recognize that, and that the confidence that we can generate by understanding that every situation is workable is not found in isolation. It's not just our nature, it's also the nature that is shared with all life, everyone else. And when we can create communities that are formed around that shared confidence, or at least the aspiration to develop that confidence, then we don't fall prey to the institutional forms of oppression that can capitalize on disaster and can capitalize on the status quo. And so, we talked last time about Naomi Klein and the shock doctrine, and how do we understand disaster capitalism to be something more like disaster collectivism. And if there's disaster, then we gather together, and if there's not disaster, we also gather together, right? And that individualism, the way that we've learned to be in that way, is in many ways a trap, and is in many ways limits our ability for resilience, right? So again, just more dimensions of or ingredients of what we might understand as our task, right? So let me see. So going a bit further, what is it now? And we can talk about this in a minute. What is it that really does bring us together, and what are the stories that we can tell and share amongst each other that allow us to have a center of gravity, you might say. So in this falling, there's nevertheless a center of gravity where there's a binding force, even though there's no up or no down. The communities that we intend to create are somehow knitted together, and the ways that that knitting happens is the ways that community will or will fail to be resilient, right? And this again is another open question. How do we, and especially in this time, when our communities have been altered in pretty radical ways, what is it that arises from this perspective that we can say, oh, this is the essence of what knits us together, right? This is what we fall back on. And this is something really important for Middle Way as a school. Many of you are part of Middle Way, and this is something that we'll have a follow-up meeting about. And this is something that communities have to have discussions about, and individuals one-on-one and in groups, because the answer to that question, it's not. There is no prescription for that, right? It's something that arises and is discovered real time. It arises in the immediacy of interpersonal relationship. It's found through exchange, and then maybe it has a label like compassion or whatever, wakefulness. We can do the thing where we write it on a whiteboard, but the vitality of that, the realness of it, comes out through the dyad or the dialogue, you might say, even if it's with many people. And there's something incredibly potent about that. And since it's coming out in real time, it has to be a conversation that is kept alive. It has to be something that I guess that's why catechisms work in some sense. It's like, this is what we believe. And when I was in grade school, I had to recite and memorize the catechism, right? And so we don't want to necessarily do that, but there's something about keeping alive the question of what is it that brings us together, and what are the shared values that knit us together, and that conversation is happening with vitality and in real time is so important. That's like the spirit, that's the breath that keeps things together. And the more that story is told and maybe elaborated upon, and also maybe that story changes over time in different ways, but as long as as the story is told, and that it is heard and that it is then retold with affirmation and maybe elaboration, that is what really holds the community together. And sometimes maybe there's someone in the middle doing the storytelling. Sometimes there's different ways that communities work. Sometimes it's happening in a more decentralized way, more self-organized way. There's many different models, but the aliveness of it is a crucial ingredient. And so, based on everything that we've talked about, that a resilient community is one that fosters human connection. A resilient community is one that is able to interpret and frame adversity and success within a coherent framework. A resilient community is one that allows for, following that, it allows for understanding what it experiences as part of a path, and that path is in many ways has the qualities of groundlessness. All these different ways of introducing themes. Hopefully we can somehow begin, collectively among whatever groups that do organize out of this talk. Hopefully that can be a ground, a seed, right, for further development, for things coming together more. So, all of these things come together in different ways. Also, I was saying, trust and experience, that follows from the framing things in terms of a path. Pride and this kind of confidence in our own basic goodness, our own nature, but also confidence in the external world as being a mirror of that. And then also, in another sense, the community coming together as a mirror, for both like a constant reminder, a constant reflection that, at least in my presentation here, that we are indeed all in a groundless situation, and that we're not denying that, and that because of just human nature, in different ways, we try to fill that in or make our community pursue ends that are not acknowledging groundlessness. Whether it's like suddenly the community is all about making money or whatever capital project, or building this or that, or all sorts of ways that communities get derailed because of filling in that space of groundlessness. The community needs to be something that reflects that that familiarity and that common centerless center, you might say. So on the ultimate level, that's really important. But then also on the relative level, the community is something that is a mirror for the individuals within it in different ways, such that we can say to another person, I have your back. I'm supporting you in that way. And because of that, I can see your blind spots. I have your back, and therefore I'm able to see things that you might not be able to see. And so there's a mirroring function that also happens that's really important in communities, because we need other people to be able to develop and grow. And so it's a community of wakefulness, right? We're waking up to groundlessness and becoming familiar with that. But it's also a community that is devoted to growing up and cleaning up, so that whatever is sort of arrested in our development, anyone who's married knows what this is like, right? Your partner can point that out in stark relief, or any intimate relationship, right? Community also fills that role, maybe in a less confrontational way, but we are mirrors for one another. We have each other's backs, and therefore we can see our blind spots. And by mirroring that, we can allow for growth, right? And when we can listen and receive that in that way, then we deepen human connection. And so that's a really important part of resilience as well, is that mirroring function that we can provide to each other, both on the ultimate level of mirroring wakefulness, and on the relative level of allowing each other to show up, and because we've grown up and we've cleaned up and so forth. So let's just we can open it up now and think about what it's like. I don't want to seed it too much or load it too much, but there's a vision here of, it's like if we're skydiving, we can do formations, right? And those formations can be, beautiful patterns. These communities that are formed in free fall can be beautiful in ways that are beneficial, right? And we can create links between each other in such a way that it radiates out and benefits other communities and other individuals around us. So anyway, so just like to hear from anyone if there's any questions or even better bright ideas and ways forward and so forth. I think the best way is to just unmute yourself, or you can wave a lot and then maybe Alexandria will find you. And it's interesting also that this free fall is deeply ecological. Groundlessness is actually something that is deeply healing for the planet when we can form our communities in that way, right? Just another thing.
Can you guys hear me?
Christy, yeah.
Yeah, hey. I really liked what you said about pride in ourselves and in the community. And that really kind of touched on something I've been thinking about lately, which was trying to keep everyone's perception elevated a little bit. At work and with kids, of course, we all have Samaya, and trying to remember and see the goodness and our basic goodness in everyone else's, and how important that is in times of disaster, and how that really affects the community. And sometimes, if I try to really focus on that, I notice it makes a big difference for everyone. And it seems like that was something you were saying in the realm of pride. And
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's been helpful trying to communicate.
Yeah, and if there's others who are also committed to, or at least know that elevation is a good idea, then when one person has the courage to do that, and it's contagious, right? And it can help the whole to become elevated, right?
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna unmute. I just wanted to participate.
Okay, thanks.
Somehow lost Alexandria.
Oh.
She's trying to get back on. And
so how do people feel relative to what I shared, or just based on your own experience right now? Where are you landing in terms of drawing resources from community? What is that like for you? Because it's sort of a human necessity, right? And how is that either a resource for you, or how has it been difficult, right?
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Nicole. Greetings from the Satchidananda Ashram in Buckingham, Virginia. Are you familiar?
Nice, yeah.
Yeah, I know yours as well. And also a big Milarepa fan. I think he's a good example of nothing like struggle in life to eventually come out of that, to be a model and of service to others. I have a lot of thoughts about what you were saying, and thank you so much. As far as how I'm sad, of course, and have compassion and empathy for the people who are really struggling right now, economically, with illness in the service industries, service fields. But I really have seen so much goodness lately. Everything from how the earth is healing itself in even such a short time, these miraculous changes. People are really, in my experience so far, and I'm in a small town in rural Virginia right now, but people are really coming together. And even if it's something as simple as a smile, people are smiling at each other more. And I think that, of course, we're inundated with the opposite, the negative side. But I try to not focus on that. That's part of my path as well. But as far as how to engage people and how to participate, I always feel like going in with fearlessness is really important. And I don't know if that really ties in with resilience, but that idea of, I don't know what I'm going to get myself into, and I know that I'm going to meet people who, come from different walks of life and have different ideas, but I'm going to be fearless about this, and I'm going to be open, and I'm going to be respectful, and I'm going to be authentic and be me. And that idea I like to take with me as a big fan, obviously, of Swami Satchidananda, is a whole idea of paths are many, truth is one. I find is a very grounding way to get going every single day. Just remembering that, yeah, you don't have to be Buddhist, you don't have to be into yoga or whatever, but everyone has their way. And if we do remember that we are more similar than we are different, and we are in this together, and we go in with that smile and that attitude of, I'm going to learn from you, I don't have all the answers, and I'm willing to be humbled, and I'm willing to be of much service as I can. I think that's one of the best ways to do it. Something else that I found really helpful as someone who's gone through a lot of struggles, I did ask about 20 years ago to be a bodhisattva, and I don't know if someone was listening to that, but maybe let's forget that. Just kidding. But yeah, I've had a lot of struggle in my own personal life, and I have found it to be strengthening in the sense that it allows me to help others. Not that I have all the answers. But one thing that I find is really helpful is, I'm not sure if you or anyone else is familiar with dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which is a kind of therapy based in Eastern traditions, and that idea of radical acceptance and also skills building. And as a teacher, I find it useful for myself, but I try to bring that into what I do. But one question I'd like to put out there is the idea of radical acceptance, or that suffering is one of the paths that often leads us to be our stronger selves. How do you address that with your work with a younger audience? I mean, I feel like that's can often be an easier thing to say or talk about with adults, but with children and young adults, if it's something like bullying, or if it's something, trouble at home, how do you say, well, you just have to exist in the groundlessness, or you have to, just accept radical acceptance, or you have to be resilient and have grit? Like, how do you walk that? I know that's a huge question, but if you would share anything that you've found helpful in walking that line with younger kids, that would be great. And thank you.
Yeah, I don't have much experience with it, because my child is so young that it's the same. I think you're referencing Tara Brach's work, but it's the same question of the balance between having a secure holding environment and then challenging that so that it can grow. And there's no easy answer, and it's situational, and it's dependent on the individuals involved and so many things. And I think it requires each person at whatever moment to trust their wisdom, and recognize that we're going to make mistake after mistake. So one of my teachers, name is Kempo Sultram Jamso, and he, and this applies to parents as well. I think he says that, making mistake after mistake, I walk the unmistaken path. So we have to ground it in our motivation, familiarize ourselves with groundlessness, and do our best to introduce challenge and protect at the same time. But I don't know. I don't have, I'm more in the protecting stage, so it's easier in some ways. But thanks for sharing that. So we're at 9:30. So should we close, Noah? How do you feel? Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we could keep going, and I have questions, but I get to talk to you other days. And I also feel like it's getting a little late on the East Coast, so unfortunately, yes. long story short, I think we have to close. So
good. Yeah. So let's just dedicate, which means whatever benefit, whatever insight, whatever goodness there is in having talked together today. And may that be dedicated to the benefit of all life, and be dedicated to all of those who are suffering, that their suffering may be relieved, and that all beings awaken to their own basic goodness, their own qualities, immeasurable wisdom, compassion. Okay, thank you, everybody.
thank you so much, Karma. I'm gonna